Welcome to the Museum of the Occupation of Latvia. My name is Pēteris Kalniņš. Our museum's mission is to remember what happened to Latvia and its people under the occupation regimes of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union between 1940 and 1991. In this podcast series, we look at the workings of the occupation regimes in light of current historical scholarship. Follow our podcasts online, or better still, come visit our museum here in Riga. In 1939, Latvia had almost exactly 2 million inhabitants. At war's end, in mid-1945, estimates run at highest to about 1.5 million for a total loss of at least 500,000 people. Thus, in 6 years, Latvia lost about a quarter of its population, one of the largest proportions in Europe. Strangely, Latvia's human losses are still being researched. In free countries, records were opened after World War II so that accurate numbers of war victims could be established. But in occupied Latvia, statistical accuracy was subordinated to the ruling ideology. In this podcast, I'll try to present the most accurate numbers that historians have arrived at since 1991. The first major population loss was the Baltic German exodus, resulting from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, beginning in late 1939. By the end of the war, Latvia permanently lost almost all of its 60,000 ethnic German citizens. The first year of Soviet occupation, June 1940 to July 41, brought the first losses through mass terror and violence when at least 18,000 people were killed or deported to Siberia. Repressions culminated on June 14, 1941, when 15,400 people were seized and deported. Just over half survived and were able to return to Latvia by the late 1950s, though years of their lives had been stolen from them. In June 1941, the war reached Latvia, and some 50,000 people fled or were evacuated to Soviet Russia to escape the rapidly advancing Nazi German army. In December 1941, Soviet authorities listed 51,000 residents from Latvia in the Soviet interior, of whom 13,700 were listed as ethnic Latvians. Possibly half of the 50,000 could have been Latvian Jews, who, by fleeing eastward, escaped being murdered in the Holocaust. After the war, at least half of the refugees returned to Soviet-occupied Latvia. During the Nazi occupation from 1941 to 45, about 92,000 people from Latvia, that is non-combatants, were killed or died in confinement. The great majority of these were Latvia's Jews, an estimated 70,000, most of whom were murdered by the end of 1941. Other victims included political opponents of the Nazis, the mentally ill, and nearly all of Latvia's Roma population. Only about 1,000 Jews in Nazi-occupied Latvia survived the war at all. After the end of the war, at least 10,000 Latvian Jews returned to Latvia under Soviet rule, though in later years many of them emigrated to in Israel or other countries. We're talking about demographics, but Latvian residents were not the only victims. Notably, up to 25,000 Jews from Germany and elsewhere were brought to Latvia and were murdered or died in confinement there. The Germans also held many Soviet military personnel in POW camps on Latvian territory, and by current estimates, as many as 80,000 may have died there. It is not known how many German soldiers held prisoner after the last forces in Latvia capitulated in May 1945 also died there. Next came military mobilization. Latvia's men were forced to fight on both sides under Hitler and Stalin. When Nazi Germany invaded the USSR, Latvian units had to fight for the Red Army. It's estimated that up to 20,000 Latvians who fought on the Soviet side died. As the Soviets recaptured Latvian territory beginning in 1944, they mobilized men in occupied areas into the Red Army. There are no precise estimates of how many of those later draftees died. By the most reliable numbers, Soviet authorities mobilized about 72,000 inhabitants of Latvia between 1940 and 1945. The Nazi occupation authorities mobilized about 110,000 people from Latvia into a range of military and police units, 78,000 of them into the Latvian Legion in 1943 and 1944. The best estimate of the total number of killed while serving in German military units is close to 25,000 men. An additional 25,400 were taken prisoner by the Western Allies at the end of the war, and most of those remained in the West and did not return home. It's not known how many Latvian soldiers were taken prisoner by the Soviets, possibly 50,000, but how many of those were killed or died in confinement, or how many went into the forest as anti-Soviet partisans, or how many men slipped through the cracks and were able to pass as civilians, is not known. Latvia's greatest demographic loss, as distinct from the loss of life, came in 1944 and 45 as the Red Army advanced and as many as 180,000 people fled or were evacuated to Germany or escaped to neutral Sweden. After the end of hostilities, around 110,000 Latvians remained in the Western occupation zones of Germany, Denmark, and Austria, as well as Sweden, while 30,000 to 40,000 returned to Latvia. Those Latvians who found themselves in territories occupied by the Red Army were forcibly repatriated. An unknown number of civilians died while fleeing or in air bombardments or were killed by marauding soldiers. Between 1945 and 1950, most refugees were in displaced person camps in Western Germany, from which they emigrated to the US, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and other countries, where they formed the Latvian exile community. After the restoration of Latvia's independence, a tiny number of exiles and their descendants returned, possibly 1%, but the vast majority remained in their countries of residence, where they had assimilated, and they're permanently lost to Latvia. The map of Latvia itself, now designated as the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic, also shrank. In late 1944, the Soviets took part of the majority Russian Obrana district, with about 43,000 inhabitants, and annexed it to the Russian Soviet Republic. In December 1949, 1,500 people were deported from the territory to purge it of Latvians or Russians loyal to Latvia. It's not known how many people from that area resettled in Soviet Latvia in the following decades. Next, we have demographic changes during the second Soviet occupation. After the war, the Soviet state began a long-term program of immigration to Latvia. In addition to returnees from Germany, both wartime evacuees and, in larger numbers, immigrants from Russia and other Soviet republics arrived in Latvia. Throughout the years of Soviet occupation, the population grew mainly as a result of large-scale immigration. The ethnic Latvian share of the population declined and never recovered to its previous level. According to Soviet statistics, 154,000 people arrived in Latvia at the beginning of the second Soviet occupation in 1945. Of these, 48,000 returned from Germany, 30,000 were evacuees eastward at the beginning of the war, 29,000 were soldiers from Latvia, now demobilized by the Soviet Army, and 47,000 were immigrants from Russia and other Soviet republics. By January 1946, the population had reached 1,554,000, and in 1946, an additional 150,000 people arrived in Latvia. A number of ethnic Latvians who had emigrated eastward in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of them had stayed in Soviet Russia after the Russian Civil War. They now moved to Latvia after the war, but this never amounted to more than 1 or 2% of the total Latvian population. In March 1949, the Soviets carried out a second, larger mass deportation, 42,000 people, or nearly 2.2% of the total population. Nearly all were ethnic Latvians. While not as lethal as the June 1941 deportation, great human losses were caused by this action, which was intended to intimidate farmers to accept collectivization and also cut support for the anti-Soviet partisans holding out in the forests. Over 5,000 people died on the way to Siberia or in the places where they were resettled. After the death of Stalin in 1953, a majority of those deported were permitted to return to Latvia by 1959, though their lives were still marred by their status as anti-Soviet elements. Beyond direct deaths, the Soviet occupations of 1940-41 and 44-91 inflicted other major demographic losses, from families being torn apart, people avoiding having children, poor living conditions, alcoholism and poor health, state surveillance and persecution, resulting in paranoia and mistrust, severe restrictions on travel and communication with foreigners, confiscated family property, selective denial of education, 2 or more years compulsory military service far away from Latvia, and problems for those who could not speak Russian. This destruction of normal civil society has after effects we still see today, including the catastrophic demographic situation.